right, so good morning. Today we're going to talk about pollinators and beneficial insects. And it is National Pollinator Week, so we are hearing about that all over the place. I even talked about it on the radio interview that's going to air tomorrow morning on KXL. The radio guy, I don't know if you guys know this, it's kind of a short stint, but we do like a 3 to 5 minute gardening bit every Saturday morning on KXL radio. And you can't do much in 3 to 5 minutes, but he wanted to talk about the aphids in his willow tree and the bugs and aphids that get up into people's trees in their yard, and then they want to like sit out in the furniture or whatever, and the aphid goo that rains down. I don't know if everyone's familiar with that, but as aphids suck on the plants, they are eating a sugar that the plants create, and then they pee out basically like a sweet sappy sugar. It's called honeydew. Such a nice word for aphid pee. But the honeydew is sticky and gross and gets all over, where you're sitting and all of that. You guys want handouts too? So it is something that people kind of pay attention to. Even though those bugs are way up in a tree, it's something that, is kind of gross and they want to take care of. And so he wanted to know, of course, what to treat his tree with. And he said, is there something I can pour into the ground because it's too high to maybe spray? And so, of course, I launched right into, how concerned are you about pollinators and beneficial insects before we talk about what you want to douse the tree with to be pulled up into the system? Now, we don't often think of a willow tree as a flowering tree, but they are flowering. They already have flowered. They're a very, very early spring blooming plant, like when pussy willows, think about when the pussy willows bloom, that's the willow's flower. So he does have an option of using a short-term systemic at this point and not having the chemical come all the way through to a flower because it's past bloom. But that is one of the things that we do want to be aware of in the counter effects of using our systemic insecticides to treat a lot of the problem insects or hard to kill insects, and when or whether or not the plant that we're treating is in bloom at that time or is about to bloom, and that chemical would then potentially be exposed to pollination interaction by the bees and the other pollinators. A lot of research is pointing now to that being one of, that chemical exposure to the pollinators as being one of the things that's kind of weakening their whole, immune system and vitality and contributing to the colony collapse disorder or some of the just, decline of our pollinator populations. But in addition to that, really a lot of it is, the decrease of wild spaces, less flowers, less weeds even, believe it or not. And weed flowers, even the dandelion, dear old dandelion, has a really great flower and a lot to offer on pollen and nectar as far as providing for our pollinators and especially our native pollinators. So the more we go after our weeds or the more we pave and build up our urban areas, the less the pollinators even want to come and visit because there's just nothing there to offer. So gardeners really stand to be on the forefront of assisting in creating little urban oases, octopi, for the pollinators to spot as they're passing through the city. And so that gives our backyards the opportunity to lure and even ultimately house a whole family and breeding life cycle and generations even of pollinators that then become more localized. And we go from things like the mason bee and the summer leafcutter bee that we learned a little bit about earlier in the season. Those are pollinators that we can kind of house and take care of a little bit more concertedly and keep them healthy and clean, and they stay within 300 feet of their homes. So the leafcutter bees, the mason bees, they pollinate our backyards and the homes right around our yards. But beyond that, they're not doing to the heart of the city and back as far as collecting pollen and then returning home. So that's an immediate benefit that you and your, community are definitely taking part of. When we offer nectar and food for butterflies, for example, those guys have far ranges and are migratory as well. So we'll see them for a while, but they don't necessarily come back every year to the same garden or to the same spot for feeding. Ladybugs, which are one of the probably best known of our beneficial insects, do have a role in pollination, and they do feed on pollen as well, so they go into flowers and they will go after pollen, but it's primarily in this beetle form that they're doing that kind of foraging. But on the side of the package, we have a example of what the, will you take that? Example of what the larval form of the ladybug looks like. And so it is important that we understand a couple of things about insects in general. One is we may be familiar with only one physical form of their life cycle and identify a ladybug at this beetle stage as a ladybug. But when we see that larva, we're like, oh my gosh, what is in my garden now? And if we go after a spray to kill something like that, that will never then grow to be the ladybug that we understand, we released in our gardens. So now, most insects have the egg form and then a larval form and then their adult form. And they look different from stage to stage. Also, insects have an exoskeleton rather than an internal bone structure, so they don't stretch inside and grow. They shed their skin like snakes do and grow from that change in their skin structure from the outside. And many bugs go through multiple moltings or sheddings before they become their adult stage. And a ladybug starts as a little tiny cluster of orange, yellow, or sort of salmon-colored eggs. Usually they're on the underside of a leaf, and usually they are on a leaf that is also on a plant associated with aphid infestations. So very common, you'll find a tiny cluster of eggs on the backside of a rose leaf, because roses so frequently have aphids on them that they just want, food to be close to the babies or the babies to be close to food. So then from the egg hatches a maybe 1/8 of an inch little replica of that critter that you see on the side of the container. It's wormy looking, only it has 6 legs. It's long and dark in color with a tiny reddish or orangish band right about at its shoulders. And then that little 1/4 of an inch critter grows, and it feeds like a teenager versus an adult. So it's in growth mode and it's voracious in its appetite. So that tiny little guy eats more aphids than the ladybug that we recognize as a regular, good guy in the garden. So I went to a garden club on Thursday and Wednesday, and I was going to talk about indoor plants. The ladies had set out, a nice table out in the garden. It was beautiful out, and we were all sitting under a kind of shady pine tree. I had all of my indoor house plants all spread out on a table, and we were ready to talk about that. And before the talk started, a woman was asking me a garden question, and she looked down on her arm, and she was like, there was a ladybug larva on her arm, and it was a really good sized one, so it was probably in what we would call its 3rd instar. Now an instar is that phase where they're growing and then shed skin. The shedding of its skin is the instar phase. So it was in its 3rd, so it had already grown and shed and was probably close to becoming a lady beetle or a ladybug instead. And so she was ready to squish or, react negatively to it until, of course, there I was. And I stopped her and I said, oh my gosh, you know what you've got there? Are you by any chance reporting the Hort lesson today? Because all the garden clubs have they give their little Hort report as part of the garden club program. She said, no. And I said, well, then let's add something because you have a baby ladybug. And then, of course, she forgot completely what question she was going to ask me. And she went around proudly to all of the other ladies with this little guy on her arm and showed off what it was. And because I am always so fond of bugs, I had in my pocket my loop, which I usually do. So I pulled out my little hand lens for some of the older ladies, and we looked at it closely. And it's got hooks and barbs, and it looks like a little monster under a magnifying glass. So they're really impressive little things. And one of the little old ladies said, "My goodness, I'm glad I'm not an aphid." Which I just thought was the sweetest little reaction to, seeing this bug that they, were formerly going to squish, and now we're standing there admiring. So it is really important as you sell that package of ladybugs, my point is, point out not only that the package has really good instructions on when to release and how to release, but people are often, as they buy, they're suspicious. And sometimes even they'll ask you, "So how do I make these guys stick around?" So the instructions on there talk about how to do that. And then, if they kill the juveniles, they'll never have ladybugs sticking around. Making sure that they understand that whole life cycle is really important. Now, the other thing, again, as we were talking about with chemical sprays, is we never spray when insects are present, beneficials are present on the plant, and especially pollinators. So we would never spray a plant during the day when bees are out. And if you do treatment, especially when we're into heat and weather advisories, it's always best to do it early in the morning before the sun even is on those plants. And that happens to also be, in most cases, before the bees are visiting those plants, because insects need the sun to warm them up before they can really get going and be active. So as long as the sun's off of those plants, you're in good shape to go ahead and treat them, as long as you're treating them with something like neem oil, Captain Jack's, something that is considered safe for the bees in the first place. So I went out and scouted for roses, and it wasn't easy to find aphids, so kudos to you all for that. One of the aphids, stressed plants. So just like we know that it is a healthy lifestyle, both nutrition, stress reduction, good sleep, taking care of ourselves, prevents diseases, keeps us from getting sick. And as we get stressed and run down and we eat poorly and we have poor sleep, we know what's going to happen. We're going to get sick. And usually then that's our body's way of just shutting it all down and making us recuperate for a while. When plants are stressed, they actually release a chemical into the air that is a signal to the insects that are nearby that says, I'm probably not long for this world. Somewhat melodramatic. They say, "Come and eat me. My life is so hard, I would rather be feasted on by aphids and at least do somebody some good." And in come all of the pests to start feeding on those stressed plants. So out in the rose bed, the plants that I found aphids on happen to be like this. Obviously missed a watering, or they are thirsty. They've been stressed. Even just lacking water is a source of stress for plants. We're finding even not just aphids, but the lace bug that is attacking people's rhododendrons and azaleas. Research shows that the lace bug is more commonly on stressed, drought-stressed, or sun-stressed plants. So the better care of your plant, feeding, watering, can actually stave off the insects. So you'll see here on my little folder, I have a rose bud, and on the rose bud, there are live active aphids. They're probably kind of freaked out right now, so they're not doing their little aphid dance, which they were doing on the rose. And you look at aphids closely, and they're all kind of like flicking and rippling on the plant. It's kind of creepy. Rose aphids are really interesting, and I don't want to go into it too much, but rose aphids are specific to roses. So they have such a specialized diet that they will only stay on a rose, which means if your rose is open, some of the other perennials, for example, the aphids are not going to go walking all over all the other plants. They will stay right on that rose. In addition, they're actually all female. So all the aphids that sit on your rose plant are female, and there's like one really busy male that flies around that colony, and he's got wings, and the rest of these ladies pretty much don't have wings. They sit there and wait, and the male visits. So aphids are quickly reproducing by the hundreds on the plant as we speak. There is a certain point in the life cycle of aphids, and I can't explain this, but they are actually born pregnant. Yes. So the egg of the aphid is inseminated. The baby aphid is fertilized and inseminated by an adult aphid before it's born to speed up the life cycle instead of waiting for that extra step. Freaky stuff, right? So there are tons of predator insects that eat aphids because they are so bountiful. It's like the grass, equivalent of the insects. We have cows and deer and all kinds of critters that forage on grass. So there's all kinds of insects that forage on aphids. Ladybugs are only one of them. My favorite is a teeny tiny wasp. Now, anytime I say wasp, people make faces because wasps are not terribly popular, and I get it. I've been stung. But this is a wasp that's not going to sting us. It's 1/8 of an inch in size. It is focused on aphids, flies around plants that have aphids, and believe it or not, aphids emit an odor of their own. So they're all communicating with one another. Even if they don't mean to, they have like a BO basically, and the wasps fly around and they're like, oh, I can smell you. And then they hunt a little more and they find the aphids. They sting the aphid with an apparatus called an ovipositor, and the ovipositor actually lays an egg inside the aphid and paralyzes it at the same time. So now we can make a horror movie from this, because I'll pass it around. Here's my loop, and you've got to get it pretty close to actually take a look at the bugs. So live aphids on the bud. A parasitized aphid on the small leaf actually still has the wasp inside. The bigger leaf has a parasitized aphid, and they're called aphid mummies at this point. Super cool. So the bigger leaf has one that if you look in the lens, you'll see has kind of a dent in it, and if you look close on the back side of it, actually, I think it might actually still have a wasp in it too. So usually when the wasp has escaped the aphid, there's a pinhole-sized exit in the backside of the aphid where the wasp pokes a hole in it. But in the meantime, before it gets out, it eats the aphid from the inside. Just wakes up and has breakfast. Then, of course, by the time it comes out of that aphid, it's like aphid bloodlust, so it just comes out going for other aphids immediately. So once you see a parasitized aphid, there you go, take a look, it's awesome.
Oh man.
Once you see a parasitized aphid on a leaf, you know that the rest of that not long for this world either, because the wasp and or the wasp's babies are going to come out and sting the rest of those aphids and just continue their life cycle. So here's where it gets crazy. If that wasn't crazy enough, right? It's Friday. If you're a ladybug, you eat aphids, right? We already went through that. But if you're a parasitoid wasp, you lay your eggs inside of aphids, and then your eggs and babies eat the aphids. So you don't really want to hang out together, you parasitoid wasp laying your family on a bush where a ladybug come along and eat that aphid. Follow? Okay, so they talk to each other with chemicals. Everywhere a ladybug walks, it leaves a stinky foot smell. Ladybugs have stinky feet. And everywhere they travel on the plant, they basically leave a scent trail that says ladybugs own this plant. And as the wasp flies by and smells aphids, it also goes, oh geez, the ladybugs are here, and goes to find another plant that doesn't have ladybugs on it. And as ladybugs tend to be a little bit more localized than the wasps who travel primarily by, they don't tend to, travel onto various plants and interact on the same plant. So then along comes the praying mantis. And our egg sacs of praying mantis, you guys are pretty thin on your beneficials, by the way. I just one egg sac and a couple of ladybugs, but maybe in the other, good. So the praying mantis is a non-discriminant eater. So we have kind of the top omnivore / carnivore of the garden. It's going to eat any insect, whether it's a spider or a bee. It's going to eat an aphid or a stink bug. So it really is going to eat anything it can catch. The larger the praying mantis grow, the larger prey, of course, they can eat. But if you put praying mantis out in the garden, don't expect to have a lot of the other beneficials necessarily, because they end up being kind of a top predator in your garden. They're really fun to watch, but again, inside this egg sac, you have about 200 of them. So they're going to cover a lot of range, and they'll leave. 150 of them may leave or even more, if your garden can't support the remainder or all 200 of them. So they have wings as well, and they'll fly off to find food or forage in another spot, or they'll eat each other right there in your garden. So, that also is kind of something to consider. So the little white aphids exoskeletons, because aphids also have to shed their skin to grow. So yeah, we see that instar, and that's a really good example of, when you see them, I used to think they were dead aphids, but that's just the outer shell. If you see it really closely, you can see it's just kind of like skin. So now the last beneficial I want to talk about is a lace wing. Now, lace wing is not the same as a lace bug. So the difference, of course, is the lace bug is a pest on our rhododendron azaleas especially, but is even found on other plants. Lace wing is beneficial, very small, green, flying insect that again has a larval stage that looks much like the ladybug larval stage. So kind of wormy, crawls along on the plants and eats more at that larval stage than it does actually at the adult stage. So lacewing adults really, lacewing larvae are the ones that they actually refer to commonly as aphid lions. And, but they eat a lot of other of pests as well. Brooks got one of my favorite books. It's in the back.
You're gonna go grab it?
Yeah. It's called Good Bug, Bad Bug. Good Bug, Bad Bug is, it's almost like a flip chart book. So the beginning of the book is all pests, and then the back of the book is all beneficials. And you see close-up photographs of the insect, and in many cases, its life cycle, various life cycle stages. And then also what attracts it and what it eats. So if we look at lacewing, here, let's look at the parasitoid wasp. So this is the parasitoid wasp. I'll pass it around again. It's teeny tiny. I mean, we're looking close up at probably, I think, a marigold flower. So the parasitoid wasp is, as I mentioned, about 1/8 of an inch in size, but there's over 200 species of this kind of wasp. So this specific one that gets aphids is an aphidist wasp. But there are other parasitoid wasps that sting and deposit eggs inside of other insects. And really what the big holdout hope is and it's not so far out, is the State Extension Agency with our Ag Department is recognizing several different insect infestations that we're dealing with. Not only the stink bug, but the white fly. We have the Japanese beetle, and then we also have the lace bug. And some of those major insect infestations that we have been seeing are all able to be handled by increasing the population of these different parasitoid wasp species that already exist here in Oregon. So they're doing studies right now just to make sure that if we bump those populations, we don't see any other kind of negative effect. But any predator insect is going to be far more effective in the long run in controlling negative insects or pests than we could ever do with sprays. And the counteraction, I mean, we haven't even done enough studies to see, what our chemicals that we use are doing, let alone what, just bumping the population of an existing insect is. They used lace wings in Florida to control lace bug. So that's kind of a fun thing to remember. Lace wings do eat lace bugs. And in the greenhouses in Florida with lace bug infestations, they released the lace wings and found that within a single season, they had 97% effectiveness in controlling the pest, just with the release of an insect. But now again, you've got to limit your chemical usage when you go for beneficial. So you've got to kind of put it all on the line and then just trust that it's going to work as well. So take a look at the parasitoid wasp and notice on that book, got it broken down. What's the life cycle? How long does it last? What does it eat? What can you do to attract them? So that's a really important point, is what types of plants we can put into our garden to attract not only the pollinators, but the other beneficials and the predators and parasitoids. So herbs especially, what happened to my time? Herb flowers especially, and believe it or not, weeds and herbs. Believe those two flowers are some of the most important food sources are beneficial insects, and the little parasitoid wasp and other little native bees love the flowers of both the culinary time and the ground cover times that we have. So this is this is Dune Valley time in bloom. Sweet little thing came out of our edible herb section. So I love to have a thyme-infused martini. After I call it a thyme-tini. Is one of the herbs that you can use when it's flowering or when it's not flowering. And the flowers are edible too. So dropping a flower into your little, or leaving it for the bees, it has multi-purpose, and people love to have little edible flowers in their salads or whatever. So leave some for the bees, take some for yourself. Dune Valley thyme is perfect for little foragers and the wasps as well. And yarrow, we usually see that in our perennial section, but yarrow is also classically an herb. That's another real strong, attractive perennial to lure beneficial insects into our garden, especially lacewings. People plant marigolds around their vegetable garden. Don't always know why. Grandma did it, mom did, I see it, or I've read it's supposed to help, but they don't really understand what marigolds do in gardens. It keeps slugs away. Marigolds are actually chocolate cake to slugs. So what marigolds do is they lure the slugs out of your vegetable garden and away from your squash and your peppers. But the marigolds are the things that the slugs are excited about. But we all have marigolds in the garden because the flowers of marigolds are attractive and powerful nectar sources for beneficial insects. They are also a flower that lures pollinators into our garden and the good guys that can help fight off on the insects and pests that might trouble our gardens. There is something, so on your handout on the back of the first page, there's something called pollinator syndromes. And rather than trying to memorize, what plant, which pollinator or beneficial likes, I think it's better to take a look at flower shapes and color and bloom time and scent, because those are different characteristics that plants have adapted to lure or attract different pollinators. So there are generalists, there are plenty of little slutty pollinators that don't care who they visit. But then there are a lot of specialists. So there's plenty of pollinator bees that are, or pollinators and bees that really only go to specific shapes or specific plants. In addition, if a flower is too complicated, and a lot of our hybrids now, frilly blossoms and big ruffled petals, maybe double, then they hide their stamens and pistils so that then the pollinator can't quite figure out where the goods are as they come up to the plant. It's more difficult for them actually to end up pollinating. Some pollinators, and specifically bumblebees, have been known to do something called nectar robbing. And nectar robbing is, the bees are after the nectar. And when they're crawling into the flower to get the nectar, somewhere on their body parts, some pollen rubs off on them. Then they go to feed nectar from another flower, and that pollen rubs back off onto the actual organs of the other flower, and that's how they move the pollen and pollinate. So there's a relationship. The bee gets the nectar, the flower gets the pollination. But if the flower is too complex and the bee knows there's nectar in there, they can actually drill a hole in the side of the blossom, a hardy geranium. Think about single 5-petaled roses. Those nice wild roses. The bumble just falls into the flower and doesn't even have to really work. They roll around, they end up with a little of everything, and then fly off without having to be very strategic or even focused. So those are all good shapes for honeybees and bumblebees. Bats, believe it or not, bats are pollinators as well. So bats prefer flowers colored in dull white, green, or purple, and have a strong musty fragrance, and especially at night. So best flower shape is a regular or bowl shaped, and ideally those flowers are closed during the day. So morning glories are flowers that get visited by bats, also by moths and other insects that fly at night. So why the flowers close up during the day is because they're saving it for their special someone. So this is, it's the birds and the bees, isn't it? We have to have a little innuendo in this kind of conversation, because really there's a lot of this, a lot of sex going on. So those flowers that are closed during the day are pollinated at night. Butterflies prefer flowers in bright colors, including red and purple, with a narrow tube shape, with a spur or a wide landing pad. But the other thing that butterflies truly love are flowers in clusters. So Cleome is a great example of a butterfly-friendly plant, because there are so many flowers in one spot to feed off of, versus a butterfly trying to go from one penstemon to another penstemon is a lot of travel time. They've got nowhere to stay while they're eating, and each flower only offers one little quick snack. If they can land on a composite flower or lantana that butterflies love, when they land on this flower, they have maybe 50 snacks in one spot, because each one of these little individual flowers is full of a sip of nectar. So it's an expensive event for a butterfly to fly from flower to flower, and they're trying to collect energy. So if they can reduce the expense of energy while they're collecting energy, they will be more efficient in their feeding. So you watch a butterfly land on a flower like this, and then they're going to feed individually into each tube before they then fly to the next flower and do the same thing. So think of butterfly bush in that cone shape. That same thing is why that is the butterfly bush. Each one of those little flowers is full of a snack. Our butterfly weed, the same style of flower. Tons of little tubes all collected together. When we look at it on the top, it looks like a bunch of little stars. But if you look at it from the side, you see each of those stars has a little tube that goes down and is a full sip of nectar for a pollinator. Bless you. So, whereas penstemon, as we talked about, is not going to be a butterfly plant, but there's two things penstemon has going on that are attracting two different types of pollinators. One, it's got color. This is as blue as some of our blue plants get, and bees do love this plant. Bees will crawl into the tube and again kind of ring the bell and get all the pollen that dusts out on them. A hummingbird also loves this shape to be able to feed off of, and the of red that you see at the back end of this flower is what kind of attracts that hummingbird to push their little beaks all the way in. So proves to them or shows depth for the hummingbird so that they know that they're not going to come out the backside of the flower, so to speak. So there are actually structures on flowers that are, some of them are visible to our eyes, and some of them are only visible in ultraviolet light. And they're called nectar guides. And so nectar guides are stripes or polka dots or patterns on the plant that in ultraviolet light literally look like landing strip lights on a airport runway, saying it's all right here, and it really focuses the pollinator right into the source so that again they're as efficient as possible. Research has actually shown that flowers with nectar guides also have less potential to have nectar robbing because they're totally advertising and making everything as simple as possible for the pollinator. The complex flowers that make it so hard are likely to just take it from the side and not give the plant its exchange, but the more helpful the flower is to the pollinator, the more likely it'll also then get the pollination that it needs. So then those helpful genes are passed along, of course, and that striping, that pollinating speckle, think of a foxglove. You look at that foxglove, those polka dots that go down into the throat of the foxglove are nectar guides. So that's showing the little bee or the pollinator crawl in, showing there's good stuff at the back. So, echinacea, or coneflower, is an example of what we call a composite flower form. So, daisies, asters, coneflowers, rudbeckia, all of them have this composite flower form. Now, not only, again, bees love to come visit these, they'll sleep literally, on top of the coneflowers at night as bees decide that they're done for the day. They kind of just, male bees sleep wherever they fall. They don't get to go back to the hive at night, so they often form little sleeping aggregates and hang out together like, hey, I'll see you at the echinacea tonight, So they're all on the plants early in the morning. Often you see them all hanging out together. But then comes a butterfly who also favors this style of flower. And the reason is that if you pull, and it's not going to work because it's such a fresh flower, but if you once the flower is a little bit more mature and the seeds are ready to kind of disperse from the plant, if you pull a petal off, you'll actually pull off a little seed. Each petal is attached to its own tiny flower, and so that means that the echinacea itself is comprised of hundreds of tiny little flowers all aggregated together into one composite. So if you look closely at it, you'll actually see that in between these kind of cone-shaped cones, there are two little curlicues. And each little curlicue is basically the sexual organ of that particular tiny flower. So that means, again, that as the butterfly comes and feeds, it has every one of those little flowers to feed off of. It doesn't just drink one meal from one echinacea. So that's why they'll spend so much time there as well. Hummingbirds also, color is important. They prefer, butterflies, red and purple, bright colors. Hummingbirds prefer flowers also in scarlet, orange, red, or white, tubular shapes, red or bright colors. But boy, as my jasmine comes into flower, the over that. So white is a very bright color, and if you do see an infrared or ultraviolet, white has a different appearance to you depending on how your vision how you have your vision. So large funnel or cup shapes and a perch support for a hummingbird is an added bonus. So if they have somewhere to land, again, they're not expending so much energy while they're trying to feed themselves. Moths, as I mentioned, so they're going to prefer pale colored flowers in dull red, purple, pink, or white. So this is a flower from Nicotiana. Nicotiana is visited by bees during the day, hummingbirds during the day, and then if the flower has a chance to produce more nectar before the evening, or as flowers that were not open during the day open later towards the evening, then moths will come by and they can pollinate also this flower. So that dull purple and the tubular shape, and then again a nice landing pad is all really helpful for moths. Strong sweet fragrance is especially attractive to moths as well. So we think of a lot of our night fragrant flowers, a lot cacti that bloom at night are pollinated by moths. And then the last plant I didn't talk about is the Phlox paniculata. So if we look at phlox, and now that we've learned about pollinator syndromes, who's going to come and visit this? Bees and butterflies and bats and moths. So as at the evening, that is actually an even more and more fragrant phlox. So the flower fragrance intensifies as in the evening, and this is one of the moths' favorite plants to visit. So, and you know, depending on how you think of moths, I mean, it's not fair, again, that people love butterflies but don't like moths, and I think it's something about them flying at night, and that they like to go to light source, and we hang around lights that makes us kind of creep out with moths. But if you look at, you know, pictures of moths, there are some absolutely amazing ones. And it's pretty cool to look closely at their bodies because they're all covered in hairs, and all those hairs, just like bees, is to collect and carry pollen from plant to plant.
When it comes to bats, do they have to pick something that's a little bit directly south of the perch on? Like how do they?
The bats can hover just like a hummingbird and feed just air, yep, hovering, and just feed in the air. So, I mean, again, just like a hummingbird, anybody sit and eat is going to be happier than having to fly and eat. So a perch is a benefit, but not essential. One of their favorite perches is the tomato cages in my garden. So they just sit there, kind of look around, and then they'll fly off, and then they come back. And so yeah, and telephone wires, they're always up in telephone wires. So then hot lip salvia, I understand you guys are all learning and identifying hot lip salvia. So, and we're only going through some of the most basic flower forms. There are a lot of crazy flower forms out there, but hot lip salvia has a lip, we call it, and that's this piece of the flower. Oop, off it goes. So that's this piece of the flower here, and this is a landing pad. So then the hood of the flower is actually where the sexual organs are, and the bee pushes back on the hood to expose the pollen and the nectar. And as they push back on it, it actually pushes out a little bit of pollen so that it just like pours a little bit of pollen on their heads. Now for most bees, the top of their head is the hardest place for them to clean, which means that if a plant can successfully put pollen on the top of the bee's head instead of just randomly all over it, then it's less likely to grab it and put it on its little pouch legs and take it back to the nest where they make royal jelly and feed the queen with. So they do gather some pollen and take it away, and it never makes it to a flower. So again, if you're a really smart flower, you figure out how to put your pollen right where the bee can't clean it off and collect it. And that's by strategically creating this hood apparatus and then hiding your goods right there so that the bee has to bump up against it with the top of their head, and therefore, while they're getting the nectar, the pollen dusts on their forehead. So again, take a close look at how that structure works. And if you guys don't have a hand lens, you really need to get some hand lenses because it's really helpful not only to look at insects up close, but to take a good look at some of these flower parts and kind of understand how they're all structured somewhat differently. Because when we look at them from afar, they're just pretty. That's it, I think.
Thank you.
Yeah.